This is one of the greatest comics that I think I've ever read in my entire life. You guys need to suggest more indie comics for me to check out and potentially cover on the channel. This is a comic called The Stranger. Now, I hit up the creative team behind it, Thomas, James, and Devlin, and told them I wanted to cover the comic and asked them if they would send it to me, which they did. Now, it's a Kickstarter, so it's only 2 issues so far, and contributing to it on Kickstarter will get us more. But we're going to cover it here. Tell me what you guys think. So, the idea behind this comic is that where superheroes traditionally try to keep their identities hidden, it follows a guy who's trying to figure out the identity of a superhero. It's pretty dope. So it starts off in 1975 with this reporter, and she says, in other news, the 94-year-old Henrik Stransky, better known as Doc Bionic, has been released from Attica Correctional Facility after 22 years due to good behavior. Known for his elaborate inventions and extravagant heists, Stransky was famously arrested in 1954 after pleading guilty to the murder of the Stranger, whose charred remains were found at Stransky's warehouse hideout following their final battle. For the younger viewers, the Stranger was a masked vigilante active from 1942 until 1954 and is often cited as the herald of the short but notable era of costumed vigilantism in America during and following the Second World War. A controversial figure celebrated by some as a hero and criticized by others due to his numerous clashes with the New York City Police Department following the 1952 Costume Code, which outlawed masked vigilantism. To this day, his true identity, which is to say the identity of the Stranger, remains a mystery. And so you pick up with Stransky while he's basically at his apartment or wherever it is that he resides after he was released from prison. A guy shows up and Stransky just says, "It's you. I knew you would be back." Now, something else that I want you to notice here, written on Stransky's hand is Wein, W-E-I-N. That's an Easter egg, and there's a boatload of these within the comic. It's one of the things that makes it so cool. This is, of course, a reference to Len Wein, one of the greatest writers and comic book editors, and even an editor-in-chief for Marvel in the history of the comic book industry. I mean, this guy's contributions cannot be overstated. But at that point, we end up switching over to a guy named Sal, right? And he says, "Rosie, are you ready to head over to Kurtz's?" And she's like, "Sorry, Sal, gotta call over to the dusty old supervillain's place, the one that got released today. The neighbors reported a disturbance." So at that point, Sal's like, "A disturbance? Right? You're getting paid overtime for that?" It's a 94-year-old man. How much of a disturbance could this old man, this old coot, possibly be making here, right? But that's where she's like, "Doubt it," right? Like, why don't you tag along and find out? And so they end up heading over there. Once they arrive, they realize the door's already open. And so at that point, Rosie's like, "Stransky," right? She calls for this guy. And when they get inside, this dude's dead. And so Rosie, in analyzing it all, just says there's no pulse. He's got a crushed windpipe. And so where Sal just kind of says, "Radio for backup," he looks up and the Stranger is just sitting there in the roof, right? In the ceiling, looking straight down at him, right? Hoping that he wasn't going to get caught. In that moment, as soon as he knows the jig is up, he immediately throws down a distraction and bails out as fast as he can, right? It's almost like a scene out of Batman Mask of the Phantasm, the greatest Batman movie ever made, including the live action movies, right? That one will be number 1. It is number 1, and it will stay that way until the end of time. But of course, this leads to the Stranger getting out of there as fast as he possibly can. Literally just beelining. I mean, this guy, right? I mean, just to show you what this guy can do, right? It's kind of nuts. This dude comes swinging out of this place like Batman, flies through a window, right, of like some abandoned loft warehouse type building, and just goes running for his life. And so as he flees, right, Sal and Rosie go to catch up with this guy, and Sal just says, "I'll go up, you check the floor, shout out if you see anything." And so as they're searching this place, Sal ends up coming across the Stranger, right? And that's where he says, "You're under arrest for the murder of Heinrich Stransky and violation of Section 3A of the Costume Code. Take the mask off and don't try anything stupid." But the Stranger doesn't really try to kill him per se. He immobilizes him, and by immobilizes him, I mean like he kicks him out of a window. But it's not enough to kill him, right? You know, it's like Batman, right? He's not gonna kill you, but you're gonna be drinking your food through a straw for the rest of your life. It's that kind of thing. But it is enough for him to make an escape. And so at that point, Sal gets on the horn, right? And he says, "This is Detective Sal De Niro of the East Precinct. All units needed. Masked Vigilante, the stranger, is moving via the rooftops, northbound on Eastman Avenue. Repeat, all units needed. Suspect is armed and dangerous. And so at that point, dispatch reports back, right? Roger that, De Niro. Eyes on the suspect heading towards the financial district. Scramble all cars to 37th, preparing to open fire. And this guy literally just like swings through the air, and it looks amazing. I mean, like, just talk about the artwork for a second, right? Like, it's dope. Like, it's absolutely phenomenal the way some of these shots are done. Now, here's where things become important. From this point going forward in the story, everything that happens matters. It is all relevant, and you have to pay attention to everything. So what he ends up doing is firing off a grappling hook, right? And at that point, dispatch chimes in again. Suspect has entered the Fawcett building through a window on the 75th floor. All units enter the building and block all exits. Now, the Fawcett building. This is a reference to Fawcett Publications, which had a comic book arm called Fawcett Comics. Why does that matter? Because they published a comic book line called Whiz Comics. Issue number 2 was the first appearance of Billy Batson in comic books. You guys see what I'm talking about with the Easter eggs, right? And these are only a couple of them. There's certainly been more in the time that we've been covering this, but there's all kinds of Easter eggs here. And it's one of the coolest things about the story. If you're familiar with comics, you know the things it's referencing, right? It's really, really dope. And so once they get into the building, Sal specifically, along with all the other cops, they go through, right, and start searching. And one of the cops says, the lady here said she smelled something burning in the garbage chute. And at that point, they pull out the costume of the stranger, which has been burned. And so Sal addresses everybody, right? He says, get the entire floor locked down. I want everyone here up. And when everyone who lives on this floor or is on this floor is brought out, Sal says, ladies and gentlemen, approximately 8 minutes ago, a murderous vigilante entered through the window behind you. The floor has been secured and your rooms have been searched, which means we know one thing for certain. The culprit is in this hallway. They've already taken one life tonight, and I ask for nothing more than your full cooperation in bringing this masked killer to justice. I am Detective Inspector Sal De Niro, and one of you is the stranger. And so at that point, we pick up with the autopsy of Stransky, and the coroner, right, basically examining all of this, tells both Sal and Rosie what's going on, right? He says, there's some clear bruising around the neck. It's no mystery that the victim was strangled to death. His neck is broken in 2 places due to the force applied. Whoever did this did it quickly. And that's what he says. We also couldn't find any fibers under his fingernails, which suggests there was not much of a struggle. And of course, Sal says, well, I mean, the guy was in his 90s, right? I mean, that's to be expected. The guy was 94 years old. How much of a struggle is he really going to put up? And so that's where it's just kind of like, yeah, this guy never had a chance. However, I told you, everything is important, right? His neck was broken in 2 places due to the force that was applied, and whoever did it quickly. You combine that with agility. You combine that with the tech that he had at his disposal. This is a person who is highly capable and very strong. And so at that point, Sal says, thank you for your time. We'll be heading back. And so at that point, they end up going along, kind of getting little bits and pieces about the nature of Stransky's life. Specifically, Rosie fills Sal in on some of the information that she found, right? He was born an Austro-Hungarian Jew. He was an actor at a theater for most of his life. He left for America when the Nazis took power. He ended up coming here. He became a mechanic. He couldn't pay the bills, so he just turned to a life of crime, combined his love of theater and engineering to become Dr. Bionic. And so, of course, Sal asks if the guy has any family, and Rosie just tells him, 1 granddaughter. Her name's Andrea, and he's been sending her mail from jail for the past 10 years. And according to the addresses on Stransky's letters, she lives at a gas station at the edge of town. And so at that point, right, Sal just says, get Central to send guys over there, right? They could check it out, and then eventually I'll go check it out once we're done with everything over at Fawcett. Because the reality here is that Sal seems to kind of expect all this to get sorted out pretty quickly, when the reality is that it's almost going to be anything but. Because what ends up happening is that once you pick up with the Fawcett building, there's 6 people who were here. Technically, there's 1 more, but there's 6 people who were here, right? There's Jack Harvey, who's an ex-football player, Cleo Crestwood, who's a secretary, Delilah Darnielle III, who's a movie star and a model, George Fairbanks, a reporter for Timely News, which is clearly a reference to Timely Comics, the company that became Atlas, which in turn became Marvel. There's Gail Rand, a retiree and a grandmother of Steve Rand, who's an inventor. And he says, but first, and they go to their first real interview, and he says, please state your name and occupation for the record. And this guy says, Raynor Charlton, CEO of Charlton Industries. Now, people familiar with comics will tell you, this is a reference to Charlton Comics. Charlton Comics is one of the most significant comic book companies in the history of the industry. Their contributions to the industry, like way beyond simply just stories, right? Like their contributions to the industry as a whole cannot be overstated here. They're huge, right? Well, at least they were. Eventually they were bought out by DC, but there's a lot of characters that came from Charlton that you know today in DC Comics. Blue Beetle, Captain Atom, these are guys that were created by Charlton and then rolled over into DC once DC Comics acquired it. But Sal asks, right, what calls you away from the wife and kids in the middle of the holidays, Mr. Charlton? Because it seems kind of suspicious, right? Keeping in mind, this is going on basically back in the 70s. So this is one of those times when men being home with their families is kind of what you do during the holidays. I mean, it still is, right? But again, folks didn't have to work as hard as they do now. So you didn't necessarily have to worry about giving that kind of thing up, right? But Raynor says, believe me, I would have stayed if I had known I'd be getting myself involved in some kind of masked manhunt. And he says, but I was called back to the city for an emergency meeting about the demolition of the old docks. It turns out the decking is rotten through. But Sal chimes in here and he says, speaking of Charlton Industries, your family quite literally made this city. So I'm sure that you have a lot riding on its well-being, but you don't stop at city planning, do you? You lobbied against Congress passing the 1952 Costume Code. Have you always had an interest in politics? And so this is where things get cool, because the response of Raynor is he says, every day we hear some news story about crooked cops. The superheroes were not some kind of miracle cure for the country's woes, sure, but they were a good start. Who knows what could have been if we'd given them a few more years to figure things out. Hell, they might have even put you guys, the cops, out of a job. And so of course, Sal asks him, are you okay with people taking the law into your own hands? And that's assuming that he didn't pick up on it before. It's one thing to be brought in and ask these different questions, but once a question that direct is being asked, it clearly creates context here, which is to say, Sal is eyeing him as a potential to be the stranger. And that's why Raynor basically just says, look, I may be a regular Johnny Miller up at the creek, which I have no clue what that means, but leaping over buildings and killing geriatrics, that's beyond even my abilities, Mr. De Niro. And so that's where Sal chimes in and says, but it would not be beyond the abilities of someone with access to cutting edge technology. And so Raynor chimes in because he cuts off Sal at the head, knows exactly where he's going. And he says, you're talking about Steve's work. Whatever he's cooked up in his room might as well be witchcraft to an old fart like me. Hell, I can barely work my straight razor. The Charlton Foundation invests in its future by funding young talent. And after what happened to his parents, which I'm sure you've heard about, let's just say it's my way of giving back. And so at that point, they move on to the next person, Cleo Crestwood. Now, her story is kind of interesting here, and it's actually relatively condensed, which almost gives you a reason to believe she's actually the stranger. And so Sal says, right, I couldn't help but notice, you're taking sleeping pills, right? The hard stuff too. Do you have a problem sleeping lately? And she just says, I just never got used to the noise of the city. So she kind of feels like this small town girl living in a big world. And so Sal asks her, right, it's 10 years since you've lived here now, correct? And Cleo doesn't really lie. She says 12, actually. Maybe it's just because things have gotten worse. Like, I don't really know. And so Sal asks her, right, you moved here from the Midwest. Your mother's still out there. No sign of your dad. Your record is fairly standard, except for one criminal conviction, a violation of the costume code. And it's almost kind of adorable when she tells this story about what happened, right? She says, That was a long time ago, and it was very stupid of me. The story of all of us as we get older, right? Like, everybody's got that story. Once upon a time, I did a dumb thing. But she says, I was 16 working at an ice cream parlor, and a guy snatched some cash out of the register. I don't really know what came over me, but I thought I could try and stop him. I made a real fool of myself in the process, but I'd never try anything like that again, right? I promise. At that point, you switch over to Steve. Now, Steve clearly is a suspect here. And this is the reason why I said you need to pay attention to everything, because what's Steve got in his hand? A grappling hook. And in fact, he tells Sal, right? Like, I haven't even shown you this one yet. He says, using compressed air, it fires a projectile without having to use any kind of gunpowder. And then he fires it off accidentally and almost hits Sal in the head with it. And so Sal's like, look, man, I want all this stuff taken into evidence, right? He's like, you're lucky I don't book you now for endangering an officer. But Sal just kind of pleads and is like, look, man, I will tell you everything I know. And he says, I heard someone running down the corridor last night just before the cops came in. And then I couldn't hear exactly, but it sounded like Mr. Charlton's door opening. And so at that point, you switch over to Steve's grandmother. Now, Gail is interesting because she gives off all the trappings of like an Aunt May type character within the comic. Because Sal's just kind of like, I mean, your grandson's a real character, right? But she says, I hope he didn't cause too much trouble for you guys. He's been having such difficulties since his parents' passing. And so Sal asks, right? He says, they were shot leaving a concert last year. A mugging gone wrong, as I understand it, right? That's a reference to Batman, obviously. And she says, indeed it was, right? I struggle to even think about it. Officer Rosie here was so helpful throughout the whole ordeal. And so Gail continues on. She says, and now, this return of the stranger. I just wish I could give dear Stevie a quiet life. And so that's where Sal says, just one more thing before we get out of your hair, Mrs. Rand. When one of our officers checked your door handle last night, he found it unlocked. And so at that point, she's like, well, you know, I do the laundry for the other residents of this floor. It makes it easier if I just keep my door open for them to leave their wash baskets inside. I just like being able to help where I can. So while clearly Gail Rand is way too old to be the stranger, either that or she is the most capable grandma in the history of the world. She, at the very least, is aiding and abetting the stranger, and most likely knows who the stranger is. And so at that point, we switch over to Jack Harvey. Now, Jack Harvey is personally my favorite character in the story so far. I love Jack Harvey, right? He says, okay, folks, let's get this over with, right? I want to get back to the game. It is March Madness at the time that we're making this, so I totally get it. He says the juice has been on a rampage this season. And so at that point, Sal's like, let's cut to the chase. He says, you've been vocally anti-costume code in the past, and you've been known to be aggressive with police officers. Despite your retirement from professional football, you're still plenty strong. So to put it plainly, Jack, you fit the bill quite neatly. And that's where Jack just says, listen, pal, right? I fought Nazis overseas just to come back and find out that they were here at home the whole time. You coppers cracking down on civil rights, segregating black folks, harassing anybody that you don't like. Those super guys and gals were the ones who actually tried to help your average Joe, which is kind of a unified theme here. Everybody supported vigilantes. So the overall theme seems to be vigilantes were popular. The government just didn't like it. So the government cracked down on them. But more often than not, what this looks like is it looks like vigilantes were helping the average Joe. So one of the things that I think you're noticing here that you probably have noticed already is that everyone here, even if they're not the stranger, has every reason to help the stranger in some capacity. And even Sal is just like, let's talk about your wife, right? She was killed in 1954, correct? The same year as the stranger's last appearance. Is there any potential connection there? And at that point, Jack just turns off the TV and just says, you leave my Susie out of this, right? She was the greatest gal who ever lived, and I miss her every single day. And so at that point, you switch over to Darnielle, right? And while she's basically putting on her makeup and, it's kind of like, oh, excuse the mess and that sort of thing. And unlike the previous interviews where it was Sal handling it, in this particular instance, it's actually Rosie, or at least it starts off with Rosie, right? She says, you've mentioned that you've been training for this role for a long time, right, Miss Darnielle? And Darnielle says, yes, right? Gymnastics, weight training, martial arts, you name it and I've done it. And on the studio's dime to boot, right? And Rosie's like, it sounds like a sweet deal, right? And she says, I hope you don't mind me saying, I'm a big fan of your films, but it's been years since you've been in such a big production. And that's where Danielle just says, all the training and prep really has taken up so much of my time. I want to get it just right. And so, of course, Sal chimes in at that point, and he says, that perfume that you're wearing, Rose Sapphire, correct? Which feels like a reference to Star Sapphire, although it might just be a reference to somebody else. I can't really think of who that person is. But he says, we used to ship it by the caseload when I worked at the dock. I thought that it was discontinued. And that's where she says, what a strong nose you have. And she's like, I've got a picture session with the studio in 10 minutes. Tonight, Dangerous makes her debut, which is kind of cool. Actually, it looks pretty dope. But the fact that she is so agile, right? She's seemingly an action actress, or at least has action work in the past. That makes her a suspect as well. Now, clearly the very nature of her character, right, dangerous, that kind of thing, this is a clear allegory to some variation of Batwoman, Batgirl, or Catwoman, or potentially all three combined. But at that point, you end up switching over to George Fairbanks, right, the reporter for Timely News. Now, this guy is a piece of work. Let me tell you, I'm gonna tell you right now, this guy is a piece of work, but it's cool, right? Because instead of it being one of these things where Sal is interrogating him, he starts interrogating Sal. So let me get a few things straight. Who exactly knew Doc Bionic's location before his murder? As far as I can tell, only the cops knew. So whoever did it must have had an inside man. And of course, Sal's just kind of like, who's interviewing who? And at that point, George is just like, look, man, back in 1954, how many men were apprehended at the scene of the stranger's murder, Mr. De Niro? The official police report states that 7 of Stransky's goons were arrested, but according to his own notes, he hired 8. Which is kind of a key here for Sal, because George knows a lot about the case. Now, you could simply just chalk that up to the fact that he's a reporter, but you could also chalk it up to the fact that he's personally involved. I mean, look at the guy's size. He's big. And so instead of answering that question directly, when Sal asks him, right, you seem awfully familiar with Doc Bionic's personal history, George just says, so I'm right then. Right? Can I quote you on that? And Sal's just like, no, right? You're just firing shots in the dark, hoping to snag a deadline. That, or you're trying to create a convenient smoke screen. And so at that point, George is like a smoke screen, right? The perfect way to describe your investigation tactics so far, interrogating us innocents when we can all see the truth. The cops killed Doc Bionic. And so Sal's like, really? The cops killed him? Right? What's your angle? Right? Are you looking to get charged for interfering with an ongoing investigation? And Rosie kind of tries to keep the peace, but that's when you start to find out that George is basically a conspiracy theorist, but he might also be onto something at the same time, because he says, come on now, right? Let's not pretend that there's not precedent for this sort of thing. Dame Liberty, remember her, another masked vigilante killed by a cop back in 1954. And we all know JFK was killed because he was planning to overturn the costume code. And so Sal's just like, you're a nut, right? And George is like, open your eyes, man. And so Sal just tells him, Watergate has you people thinking everything is a conspiracy theory. And so George is just kind of dismissive of this statement, right? He says, look, I don't know for sure how deep all this goes, but I know that I'm onto something. And I think you know that too. If you're good people, you'll look into this, right? That's all I'm saying. And so at that point, we kind of get back to what's basically the drawing board, right? With all these little clues and bits and pieces that have all piled up. And Rosie asks Sal, right, what's your hunch telling you so far? And so Sal kind of condenses it all down for us, right? And he says, I don't even know where to begin. Steve has the means and a potential motive if we can find a link between Bionic and his parents' killer. Both Jack and George have a distaste for authority. They could have killed Bionic in an attempt to frame the cops. Although they both have the physicality to pull it off, George's intimate knowledge of the case was noteworthy to say the least. But why did he act out like that, right? Was it nerves or was it planned? And he says, I don't like Rayner, right? He's got the means, but he has no motive. Of all of them, he's got the most to lose. Would he really risk it all for simple thrill-seeking? Delilah's clearly hiding something criminal or otherwise. This movie that she's shooting is an overly convenient cover-up for getting in shape and collecting costumes. So we have to check in with the studio as soon as possible to verify what she's told us. Gail is close with everybody on the floor. It's a good way to get others to cover for her or her grandson. Cleo was the most obviously nervous. So what she got to hide. We have to look further into her prior conviction. And since when did an attempted civilian's arrest get you charged under the costume code? And he says, I hate to say it, but they all fit the bill in one way or another. They're wealthy, they have plenty of free time, either an inflated sense of justice or a compulsion to seek thrills. They all have the makings of a costumed vigilante, but only one of them is the stranger. And so at that point, right, with him basically saying, I don't really know what the answer to this question is, the only other thing he can do is turn to the lead that he asked about earlier, the granddaughter of Stransky. And he asked about that, right? Like, did they end up going to his granddaughter's place, that gas station out on the edge of town? What did they find? And Rosie just tells him, right, it's empty, abandoned for years. No sign of an Andrea Stransky or her letters. And so at that point, Sal's like, then I'm gonna go take a look, right? Do you wanna come along? She's like, nope, I can't really go with you. I haven't seen my kids in like 24 hours. The sitter fees are gonna bankrupt me, right? And so Sal ends up going out there by himself. Now, once he gets into this gas station, there's, crime scene tape around it and nothing to really indicate that a crime had taken place here. Likely it's just to keep folks from going in there so that police can kind of investigate it and, see it as it was frozen in the moment, right, from the last time anybody accessed it. But as he gets in there, he ends up finding just this old car, which looks amazing. But once he opens it up and then he looks in the glove compartment, he ends up finding a document. And the document says property of Rainer Charlton. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Let me know what you guys think, right? Give me some more indie comics to cover. Let me know what you guys think. Let me know who you think it is. And make sure you guys check out the Kickstarter down in the description so we can get the comic funded and get more of this comic made. And I will catch you all later. Peace.